When a heavy cruiser absorbs multiple torpedo strikes and sustains surface gunfire, the structural outcome can be catastrophic, but it is not a single mechanical certainty. The ship loses speed, takes on flooding, and may roll or settle under the combined effects of blast damage, shell fire, and progressive loss of buoyancy before descending into the dark. This irreversible step transformed the USS Houston from a formidable combat platform into a silent mass tomb during the Battle of Sunda Strait. The engagement against a massive Japanese invasion fleet on the night of February 28th and the early morning of March 1st, 1942, stripped the United States Navy vessel of its fighting capability. The damage forced the ship beneath the surface of Banten Bay. Down in the harsh underwater environment, the battered steel came to rest in depths ranging from 95 to 125 feet. Hundreds of United States sailors and Marines were lost in the sinking and in the brutal captivity that followed, while the wreck itself remains the final resting place of nearly 650 sailors and Marines. The staggering human loss immediately established the wreckage as a sacred final resting place and a protected United States sunken military craft. The human toll forged a boundary that transcends standard marine salvage engineering. The sunken hull was no longer a mechanical asset to be refloated, patched, or recovered for scrap. It remained sovereign property under United States stewardship, and any future operation had to prioritize preservation, respect for the dead, and carefully controlled non-intrusive documentation. For decades following the end of the Second World War, the exact physical condition of the wreckage remained a complex open question. The ocean does not preserve broken steel perfectly, and unmonitored coastal waters inherently invite unauthorized intrusion. To properly protect a sunken military casualty, the governing state must first establish a definitive baseline of its true identity and its present physical state. Positive identification serves as the primary and most critical survey target. Formal verification that the massive metal object resting on the sea floor is the exact hull of the Houston does not create sovereignty from nothing. Instead, it gives the protecting authorities the evidence needed to strengthen stewardship, coordinate with Indonesia, and distinguish lawful monitoring from unauthorized disturbance. The framework of institutional protection depends on strong visual, acoustic, and documentary evidence, not on assumption alone. The mandate requires naval engineers to formally document the dimensions, the overall orientation, and the defining physical characteristics of the submerged object. Finding a large submerged structure in the bay is only the preliminary phase. To secure lasting protection, investigators must match the seabed anomalies against the historical architectural blueprints of the lost cruiser. Historical assumptions, survivor accounts, and general coordinates could support the search, but only a documented chain of physical evidence could remove doubt about the wreckage in Banten Bay. This critical operational need for a definitive evidentiary baseline immediately collides with the severe jurisdictional boundary. That restriction is narrow but firm. Disturbance, removal, cutting, or injury to the wreck requires explicit legal authority, and the survey itself must remain non-intrusive. The very framework designed to protect the fallen personnel creates a massive operational obstacle for the naval engineers trying to document the wreck. The ethical and legal mandate of preservation acts as an invisible wall around the site. The conflict between the need for forensic proof and the prohibition against unauthorized physical disturbance defines the modern operation. To shield the cruiser from modern underwater threats, the governing state must understand the wreck's condition without treating it like a salvage target. The boundary demands extreme operational discipline. The violent loss of the vessel created a sealed underwater environment, and the authorized mission is built around keeping that seal unbroken. How do engineers assess the condition of a complex structure they are permitted to document but not to disturb? Operating at that shallow margin creates a deceptive operational window. At this shallow margin in Banten Bay, a sunken vessel does not sit in quiet isolation. It sits in coastal water shaped by tidal flow, poor visibility, and shifting sediment. Tidal forces through the Sunda Strait can churn the bottom and narrow the safe windows for any maritime team. Divers working around twisted steel may face drag, entanglement hazards, and rapidly changing conditions. The environment limits how long they can work and dictates terms before a single diver enters the water. Beyond the tidal flow, the local threat profile is compounded by historical hazards that must be treated with caution. The site has documented evidence of potentially live World War II ordnance, and oil seepage has been observed from the wreck area. Those hazards add explosive, environmental, and toxic concerns to an already difficult physical setting. The environment is dangerous, yet the operational team must navigate those risks under the strict mandate of a protected wargrave and sovereign military craft. These severe environmental hazards sit inside the larger legal framework of sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity is the foundational principle that a sunken military vessel remains the property of its flag state unless that state expressly abandons or transfers title. Ownership does not simply pass with time, and the structure is not treated as abandoned scrap. The United States Navy retains a sovereign interest in the steel and its associated contents. This mandate forbids unauthorized disturbance, removal, injury, or salvage. The sunken cruiser is not a forgotten shipwreck waiting to be claimed by commercial enterprises. It is a sovereign military craft and a protected wargrave resting on the sea floor. Enforcing this sovereign property right requires authorities to establish a credible baseline of the hull condition. A baseline is the way future degradation or unauthorized interference can be distinguished from damage already present. To generate that record, an official survey deployment must be authorized. The baseline requirement does not demand a perfect interior inspection. It demands enough external geometry, video, and contextual evidence to document how visible sections of the steel rest against the seabed, where accessible fractures appear, and where disturbance can be seen. However, this deployment must operate under the jurisdictional boundary. The legal framework blocks unauthorized physical disturbance. The official survey team cannot cut into the hull, move unexploded ordnance to clear a line of sight, scrape marine growth, or shift twisted bulkheads without specific authority. The denial regime is therefore completely twofold. The primary barrier is the strict jurisdictional law that treats the wreck as a permanent sovereign asset. The secondary barrier is the severe underwater environment of the strait. The high-velocity currents and the zero visibility conditions act as a natural physical lock, while the legal framework acts as an unbreakable administrative lock. The precise depth of 95 to 125 feet is easily reachable by commercial diving standards. While the official military team is bound by strict non-intervention rules, this shallow accessibility leaves the wreckage highly vulnerable to unauthorized commercial divers operating outside the law. To counter any illicit threat, the official survey team must establish the current structural baseline quickly and comprehensively. If the severe environment and the governing law forbid physical entry, how can the remaining structure be mapped? The joint United States and Indonesian survey team deployed from the rescue and salvage ship USNS Safeguard in 2014 facing a massive sensor problem. Capturing the geometry of a sunken heavy cruiser without making physical contact forces engineers to rely entirely on remote acoustics and strict non-intrusive diving techniques. Over the course of 19 documented dive excursions, the combined military team executed a meticulous mapping sequence. The survey therefore turned on remote acoustic sensors and exterior visual cameras. Those tools had to work from a safe standoff distance without clearing debris, scraping marine growth, or penetrating the hull. To map the invisible structure, the engineers initiated the survey with side-scan sonar passes and other remote documentation. The acoustic pulses swept through the water column, bouncing off the massive steel anomaly resting on the bottom. The returning sound waves painted a broad profile through acoustic shadow and target shape. The sensor data indicated a hull footprint broadly consistent with a cruiser about 600 feet long, the recorded overall length of the original heavy cruiser being just over 600 feet. It became the first major identification layer without disturbing the fragile steel. With the acoustic footprint formally established, the operational team needed reference points in the water for the dive teams. To create that framework without placing anchors or heavy gear onto the war grave, the engineers used marker buoys near the ends of the acoustic target. By keeping the markers adjacent to the wreck rather than directly on the hull, the team could orient divers without adding structural disturbance. The distance between the marker buoys was recorded at approximately 510 feet. That spacing framed a substantial portion of the cruiser's visible length and gave the divers a controlled external reference inside the hostile marine environment. The 19 dive excursions utilize this precise buoy grid to conduct close-quarters visual inspections. Navigating strictly along the established perimeter, the military divers carried advanced video recording equipment to trace the exposed portside and the upper deck structures. Maintaining neutral buoyancy in the water column became the divers' practical safeguard against accidental contact with the steel. If a collapsed deck plate blocked the view of a crucial engineering space, the divers simply recorded the obstruction and moved past it. The cameras could only capture the outermost shell of the structural casualty. The combination of the approximately 510-foot buoy bracket, sonar data, and video documentation produced a strong initial condition record of the sunken vessel. It did not create a perfect three-dimensional model of the entire wreck site. The 2014 team proved that a massive underwater target could be positively identified and assessed without violating the mandate against disturbance. Later remote sensing would add a broader view of the entire wreck site, but this first survey still confirmed the dimensional match and recorded critical visible portions of the primary steel. What did the external acoustic and visual data reveal about the ship's final combat geometry? The massive geometry of a sunken 600-foot heavy cruiser traps the final moments of its combat sequence firmly into the seabed. By analyzing the coherent main hull evidence captured by the external cameras, naval historians can reconstruct the final tactical decisions made during the extreme surface engagement. The exterior architecture of the steel provides a permanent physical record of the vessel dying in combat. The primary hull body rests in a specific configuration that immediately locks into the historical accounts of the battle. The most critical piece of main hull evidence is the orientation of the surviving structure. The visual and acoustic data confirm that the bow of the warship faces east. This heading points away from the exit of Sunda Strait and is consistent with written accounts of Houston fighting inside Banten Bay against the Japanese invasion force, but it cannot by itself prove every helm order or tactical decision made in the ship's final minutes. The enormous steel frame preserves the posture in which the cruiser came to rest after losing buoyancy and settling into the bottom sediment. Mapping the intact exterior hull sections allows the engineering team to verify the broad mechanics of the loss. The outer shell displays the immense force required to sink a heavily armed warship. Large-scale damage visible on the main hull aligns with reports of torpedo strikes and surface gunfire. The coherent structure provides a perimeter of destruction. However, the exact progression of flooding and the internal collapse sequence remain beyond the scope of a non-intrusive survey. That limitation leaves a practical proof ceiling. The lower engineering spaces and primary ammunition magazines remain beyond exterior visual inspection. Internal bulkheads, watertight doors, and hidden damage paths remain behind exterior plating and collapsed structure. Exterior cameras could document the outer boundary of combat damage, but they could not follow the flooding chain inward. Some evidence could still be inferred from external damage, survivor accounts, archival records, and future non-intrusive sensing. Direct access to the lower engineering spaces would require intrusive authority beyond this mission. The massive hull provides a strong record of the final resting orientation, but it also serves as a sealed archive. The intact exterior gives important proof for the historical combat record and for the broad loss mechanics. The engineers mapped the outer boundary of the damage without violating the non-disturbance mandate. Yet a severe physical discrepancy exists right at the outer edge of this coherent structure. If the main hull supports the historical combat record, what is happening to the perimeter plating? The physical evidence surrounding a sunken military casualty should display a unified pattern of historical battle damage, but the debris field and the outer perimeter of the Houston reveal a massive chronological contradiction. The torn steel shows the extreme chaotic force of wartime torpedoes existing directly alongside the clean, methodical cuts of modern extraction. This contradictory evidence defines the exact nature of industrial scavenging. Industrial scavenging is not the casual, opportunistic theft of small souvenirs by recreational divers. It is the illicit, systematic dismantling of massive underwater structures. The process requires heavy commercial maritime assets, including surface barges, heavy lifting cranes, and specialized underwater cutting tools. These illegal operations target sunken warships to harvest massive quantities of scrap steel, copper wiring, and brass fittings. The sheer scale of the operation requires teams of divers working for consecutive days to separate the heavy armor plating from the internal frame, leaving a highly specific forensic signature. During the joint dive excursions, the survey team documented specific patterns of illicit salvage across the site. The military divers recorded that contrast in the geometry itself. The visual cameras recorded clean, sheared seams, missing exterior plating, and long structural lines where heavy steel rivets had been removed one by one. The most undeniable proof of this modern degradation rested directly on the decaying structure itself. While documenting the missing plates, the dive team discovered a modern scavenger's hacksaw and a mechanical marker tool abandoned right next to a series of empty rivet holes. This discovery became the condition assessment's anchor proof, removing ambiguity about modern interference. It physically confirmed that commercial crews were actively dismantling the protected war grave piece by piece, stopping only temporarily. This active interference severely limits the forensic value of the surrounding seabed. The detached artifact scatter surrounding the main wreckage is heavily compromised. In a protected marine site, the off-hull evidence helps forensic teams understand the breakup sequence and the final moments of the sinking. Artifacts thrown clear during the violent descent define the trajectory of the vessel and the failure of the upper decks. Unsupervised removal damages that context before investigators can map it. The unauthorized recovery of a ship's trumpet from the seabed in 2013 removed an artifact from its original context and raised urgent concern about the vulnerability of the wreck. The trumpet was a historical object, and its position on the seabed may have carried contextual value for archaeologists. Taking it away without a formal archaeological grid weakens that context forever. The remaining fragments were still part of the engineering and historical puzzle, but they had become some of the site's most vulnerable evidence. The combination of abandoned cutting tools, missing metal plating, empty rivet holes, and compromised artifact scatter provides a strong physical record of unauthorized disturbance. The survey team gathered necessary evidence that the site had been systematically interfered with and was vulnerable to further illicit salvage. The formal condition record of the wreckage therefore had to include both the combat damage and the visible extent of later disturbance. With the physical reality of the site documented, the operational challenge shifted from structural documentation toward international stewardship and enforcement. How does a sovereign state protect a measured baseline condition when physical fencing is impossible? The successful completion of the 2014 joint dive exercise forces a sharp administrative trade-off. The resulting record changed the problem rather than ending it because the same intelligence gain exposed a severe physical vulnerability. The United States Navy gained a strong evidentiary record of disturbance, but the sovereign state has no physical walls to place around the fragile steel. The wreckage remains exposed to the ocean and to illicit maritime operators who may navigate the region. The state traded operational uncertainty for a better defined, but still physically vulnerable reality. Even so, the naval operation established a formal initial condition baseline and entered it into the stewardship record. Prior to the expedition, the true state of the sunken heavy cruiser remained a dangerous unknown, leaving the war grave vulnerable to quiet, untracked destruction. After the survey, military historians and legal authorities possessed a metric-based architectural profile supported by imagery and documentary research. The joint military deployment fulfilled the positive identification requirement, matching the underwater anomaly to the known cruiser. It also documented the nature of unauthorized disturbance, placing the evidence into the permanent preservation and enforcement record. The same baseline became the mechanism for future defense and stewardship. Later changes on the seabed could be compared against it before being classified as new intrusion, historical battle damage, or natural marine decay. In practical terms, the record turned an unmonitored casualty into a measured sovereign asset, with evidence usable against maritime theft. Enforcing that protection remains an incredibly complex logistical challenge. Because the underwater site cannot be fenced, management must rely on legal authority, Indonesian cooperation, periodic monitoring, public awareness, and diplomatic coordination. The established baseline gives those measures a reference point for assessing future reports, supporting enforcement action, and deterring commercial salvage crews from returning to the coordinates. The remaining limit is enforcement capacity. The boundary is invisible, and its strength depends on people, governments, surveillance opportunities, and the deterrent effect of documented evidence. If a rogue commercial barge drops anchor over the site at night, authorities must depend on reporting, coordination, and enforcement capacity to trigger a response. The operational legacy of the massive sunken cruiser is now firmly bound to this continuous international watch list. The vessel's defense has shifted from armor and weapons to continuous disciplined monitoring of the established baseline condition.